Hey everyone, Nick from Accounting Add-ons here. The question we get the most often relates to finding fields that are missing. Many of you will pull an endpoint into Power Query and wonder why you can't find the customer name or lines on an invoice. Now rest assured, all those fields are available, and I'll show you how to find them. I'm in Power Query and you can see I have a sales data endpoint on the right. If I expand it, you'll notice exactly as I described. There's no customer details, there's no lines on the transactions. It seems like that data is missing. But it's not missing, it's just not usable yet in Power Query. To actually use those fields, what we'll do is right-click on the dataset and choose Edit Query. And this will bring us to the Power Query editor. Now you'll notice immediately, right here is the customer column. But it says the values are record. And if I scroll across, I can find my lines, but it says the values a table. Now what's happening? Notice when I selected the first line's value, a table appeared at the bottom of the screen. Now the lines column is a table of lines, meaning an invoice can have multiple lines. And because of that, each line will have a row ID, a type, a description, a ship quantity, and so on. It's got a whole bunch of different fields. And consequently, the data can't be represented directly in Power BI because it's not a discrete value. It's not text, it's not a date, it's not a number. It's a record of information. And in this specific case, it's a table of information. If I go back to my customer record, the same thing happens. If I select the first customer, notice at the bottom, I can see UID name and display ID. Now a customer is a record. It actually has multiple fields inside it. And as such, in order to get to the data, we need to add a transformation to pull the information out of the customer record and into our data set. On the right-hand side of the customer column, there's a drop-down pointing left and right. And what that drop-down allows us to do is select the fields that we want to pull out of the record and into our data set. If I click on it, I get to tick which field I want to include. For instance, I might just want the name and a display ID. So I'll untick UID and I'll click OK. And doing that has pulled the discrete value, the customer name and the customer display ID, into my data set. The same can be done with lines. If I go to the lines column and click on the drop down, I get to choose all the different fields that I want to include coming from the lines table. For instance, I might want the description, the quantity, and the total. And if I select those three and click OK, those three columns will be expanded. Now that's called expanding the data, and you can actually see it added an instruction called expanded lines. If I want to revise that step, I can click on the little gear icon, which will bring up the same dialog I was in, and I can actually tick other fields or untick the fields I don't want. And that is how you actually access the fields to pull into your data set. Now there's a small caveat. Whenever you include fields coming from a record column, such as customer, there's no issues. You can include the fields, it won't cause any harm. But the risk is if you do the same thing for the lines, you really have to be mindful of what happens to your data. You can actually see, if I scroll back to the right, this is my sale ID. And the same sale ID got repeated 3 times. And that's because that sale, when I was showing you before in the table below, had 3 lines. So what Power Query did is it pulled each line as a separate record and included the same header information that was already there and repeated it down the page. But the risk is, if I decide to use any column such as total tax, I would be duplicating the figures because each value gets repeated down the page. Tax is a bad example, but if I go to subtotal, you'll see 100, 100, 100 repeated down. 25, 25, that invoice had 2 lines. This one had 2, 28, 28, and this one had 1. So now I've got to be careful because I shouldn't really use a subtotal, because if I do so, I'll be duplicating the data. Once I finish my transformation, I can click Close and Apply, and that will return me to Power BI. And if I expand the data endpoint, you can actually see now the customer fields. You can actually see the lines field down here. And that's how you can actually pull the missing fields that are not appearing in your data. So the fields are there. It's just you need to actually expand them. You need to get into them. You need to drill down to that information because it's a record of information or it's a table of information.